In 1918, a regiment of black American soldiers was handed to the French army. Like unwanted cargo, the U.S. military didn't want them fighting alongside white troops. They were given the worst equipment, denied recognition, and told they'd never measure up, but within months they became the most decorated American unit of World War I, and their own country tried to bury the story. This is the story of men who were told they weren't good enough to fight for their own flag, men who proved everyone wrong, and men whose heroism was so undeniable that America had no choice but to erase it from history. When America entered World War I in 1917, over 350,000 black men answered the call to serve. They enlisted, they were drafted, and they showed up ready to fight for a country that had never fought for them. But the U.S. military had other plans under Jim Crow policies that infected every corner of American life. These men were placed in segregated units, most never saw combat. Instead, they were assigned to labor battalions, digging trenches in the mud, hauling ammunition through artillery fire, and burying the bodies of white soldiers who were considered worthy of a hero's death. The message was clear: black men could serve, but they could not be soldiers. White military leadership genuinely believed that black men lacked the courage, discipline, and intelligence for combat. Racist pseudoscience of the era claimed that black soldiers would break under pressure, that they'd run from battle, that they'd endanger the white troops around them. So even when black units were trained for combat, they were kept away from the front lines. The 369th Infantry Regiment, originally formed as the 15th New York National Guard, was one of the few all-black combat units. They trained for months, they were ready, but when they shipped out to France, the U.S. Army didn't want them. American commanders faced a problem. They needed troops, but they refused to let black soldiers fight under the American flag alongside white units. The solution was as cruel as it was calculated. They gave the 369th to the French, literally handed them over like damaged goods. The regiment was stripped of their U.S. insignia, given French helmets and rifles, and placed under French command. The symbolism was devastating. These men had volunteered to fight for America, and America had rejected them so completely that they weren't even allowed to wear the uniform. But the humiliation went deeper. The U.S. military distributed a secret document to French officers titled Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops. This wasn't intelligence about enemy movements or tactical advice. This was a racist propaganda piece designed to poison the French against their new soldiers. The document warned French officers not to treat black soldiers as equals, not to eat with them, not to shake their hands, and certainly not to commend them too publicly. It claimed that black Americans were a menace, prone to sexual violence, fundamentally inferior, and a threat to white civilization. The goal was transparent: ensure that even in France, thousands of miles from Jim Crow's legal reach, these men would still be isolated, degraded, and reminded of their place. The French, to their credit, largely ignored it. France had its own colonial troops from Senegal, Morocco, and Algeria fighting with distinction. French officers had learned to judge men by what they did under fire, not by the color of their skin. So when the 369th arrived, exhausted from rejection and burning with something to prove, the French sent them exactly where they needed to go: the front lines, the worst sector, the place where courage wasn't optional. The 369th Infantry Regiment was assigned to the Champagne-Marne sector, one of the most brutal stretches of the Western Front. This was where trenches turned into mass graves, where German artillery pounded positions day and night, where poison gas drifted through the darkness and men drowned in mud. Other units rotated and out, given rest, given relief. The 369th stayed. They spent 191 consecutive days on the front lines, no breaks, no rotation, just constant grinding combat. And they never lost a trench, they never lost a prisoner, they never gave a single inch of ground to the Germans. The soldiers of the 369th Fought with a fury that their own country had never imagined they possessed. They volunteered for the most dangerous assignments they conducted. Night raids deep into German territory. They held positions that other units had abandoned, and they did it all knowing that back home their families were still living under Jim Crow, still being lynched, still being told they were less than human. These men weren't just fighting the Germans, they were fighting to prove that every lie America had told about them was exactly that, a lie. On the night of May 15, 1918, two soldiers from the 369th were on guard duty at an isolated outpost, Private Henry Johnson and Private Nem Roberts. It was dark, quiet, the kind of silence that made you hear your own heartbeat. Then the grenades started landing. German raiding party, 24 men, had crept through the darkness to capture prisoners and gather intelligence. They expected easy targets. They found Henry Johnson. Johnson and Roberts fought like men possessed, outnumbered 12-1. They fired until their ammunition ran out. Roberts, severely wounded, kept loading grenades and passing them to Johnson. When Johnson's rifle jammed, he used it as a club. When that broke, he pulled out his bolo knife. He fought hand to hand in the darkness, slashing, stabbing, refusing to let the Germans take his position or his partner. Johnson was shot multiple times, stabbed, hit with grenades. He had 21 wounds. When the sun came up, he should have been dead. Instead, he was standing over the bodies of 4 German soldiers he'd killed, and the rest of the raiding party had retreated in disarray. Word of the battle spread like wildfire. The French were stunned. They immediately awarded Johnson and Roberts the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. These were the first Americans of any color to receive it in World War I. The story made newspapers around the world. For a brief moment, America had to acknowledge what these men had done, but it was uncomfortable. It didn't fit the narrative, so the praise was muted, the coverage faded, and the war continued. The Germans, meanwhile, had a different response. They started calling the 369th Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. Later, the name evolved into Hellfighters, and it stuck. German intelligence reports noted that the 369th fought with unusual aggression and showed no fear in close combat. They weren't wrong. The soldiers of the 369th had nothing left to lose. They'd already been treated like they were worthless. If they were going to die in France, they were going to die, proving every racist wrong. By the time the war ended, in November 1918, the entire 369th Infantry Regiment had been awarded the French Croix de Guerre, not just individuals, the entire unit. 171 soldiers received personal medals for extraordinary valor. They had compiled a combat record unmatched by any other American regiment. They were legends in France, heroes who had bled for a country that wasn't even their own. And then they came home. In February 1919, the Harlem Hellfighters marched up Fifth Avenue in New York City. Thousands lined the streets. The black community came out in force, cheering, weeping, celebrating their heroes. For one shining moment, it seemed like something had shifted. These men had proven themselves. They had medals, they had glory. Surely things would be different now. They weren't. The U.S. military refused to officially recognize the French medals. There were no parades in most American cities, no ticker tape, no presidential commendations. History books began to be written about World War I, and the 369th was nowhere in them. Newspapers stopped covering their story. It was as if they had never existed. Henry Johnson, the man who had fought off 24 Germans and become an international hero, was denied disability benefits. The wounds that had nearly killed him left him unable to work. He died in poverty in 1929. Forgotten, broken, 32 years old. This wasn't an accident, this was a choice. White America had a problems, the narrative of black inferiority, the justification for segregation, for Jim Crow, for the entire racial hierarchy that governed American life. It all depended on the idea that black people were lesser, weaker, incapable of the Courage, discipline, and intelligence. That defined true Americans, but they. Harlem Hellfighters had shattered that lie so completely, so publicly that there was no way to argue around it. They had been the best, not good, the best, so they had to be erased, and there was another reason for the eraser. The summer of 1919 became known as the Red Summer. Race riots erupted across America. White mobs attacked black neighborhoods in city after city, and they specifically targeted black veterans. Men who had worn the uniform, who had fought for their country, were beaten in the streets, lynched, murdered. The sight of a black man in a military uniform was considered an act of defiance. These men had tasted equality in France. They had been treated with respect. They had proven their worth, and that made them dangerous. The message from white America was unmistakable: you may have fought for us, but you are still not one of us. You are still less than, and if you forget that, we will remind you. The secret document that had warned the French about black troops wasn't declassified for decades. Most Americans didn't learn about the Harlem Hellfighters until well into the 21st century. Textbooks taught World War I as a story of American heroism and sacrifice, and they simply left out the most decorated American unit. Even the valor of the 369th was considered too dangerous to remember because it challenged the foundation of American racism. In 2015, 97 years after he saved his position and killed 4 enemy soldiers with a knife in his bare hands, Henry Johnson was finally awarded the Medal of Honor. President Obama presented it to his descendants in a White House ceremony. By then, every single member of the 369th Infantry Regiment was dead. The recognition came only when their story could no longer threaten the living, only when it was safe to call them heroes, because they were no longer around to demand the equality their heroism had earned. The Harlem Hellfighters weren't erased by accident, they were erased on purpose. Their courage, their record, their undeniable excellence, it exposed the lie at the heart of American racism. They were living proof that black men didn't need permission to be great, didn't need validation to be brave, and couldn't be stopped by anything except deliberate, systematic eraser. They fought 2 wars, one against Germany, one against their own country's determination to keep them invisible. They won the first war. The second one is still being fought. They called them inferior, gave them away like garbage, told them they'd never measure up, but these soldiers fought back, not just against the enemy in front of them, but against a nation that wanted them to fail, and they won. History tried to bury them. Our job is to dig them back up, to say their names, to make sure that the next generation knows what these men did and what was done to them. Because the truth, no matter how long it's hidden, doesn't stop being true. And these men were heroes.